series. Thanks to everyone who's here in person and those who are joining us online. My name's Holly Fernandez Lynch. I co-chair the Rep series along with Steve Jaffe. And today we are really excited to welcome Dr. Paul Offit, who's going to talk with us about what went well and what went wrong during the COVID pandemic from the FDA Vaccine Advisory Committee vantage point. I'll say a few words of introduction in just a second, but I have our usual housekeeping announcements. This is the last rep session of 2024. We had an international guest lecturer lined up for December who unfortunately we have to reschedule. So we're going to be back on January 14th with Amanda Dinofia from CHOP, who will discuss applying for and holding INDs for early phase high risk trials. And then the other thing to note for 2025 is that REPS is moving to the second Tuesday of every month rather than on Wednesdays. So please make sure to mark your calendars accordingly. You can see our slate of speakers for the spring up here, and you can find this list on our department's website. Please continue to let us know folks that you would be interested in hearing from as part of this series, especially individuals from diverse backgrounds and who would contribute diverse perspectives to issues relevant to research ethics and policy. And then a quick reminder about online resources from our department. We have a series of short research ethics courses available for free continuing education credit, some of which can also be used to satisfy the human subjects training requirements at both Penn and CHOP. And then thank you to our usual REPS co-sponsors who you see listed here, and special thanks to Lisa Bailey, who is coordinating the REPS series for us. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Paul Offit, who is director of the Vaccine Education Center and professor of pediatrics in the Division of Infectious Diseases at CHOP, as well as the Maurice R. Hilleman Professor of Vaccinology at the Perelman School of Medicine. Dr. Offit is an internationally recognized expert in the fields of virology and immunology and co-inventor of the rotavirus vaccine RotaTeq, which is recommended for universal use in infants by the CDC. Dr. Offit was a member of the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices to the CDC, and he is a member of FDA's Vaccines and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee. He's also founding advisory board member of the Autism Science Foundation and the Foundation for Vaccine Research, a member of the Institute of Medicine, and co-editor of the foremost vaccine text titled Just Vaccines. Doing work in this space, Dr. Offit is unsurprisingly sometimes in difficult engagement with vaccine critics. He has played an important role pushing back against scientific denialism, more broadly speaking. He is the recipient of awards too numerous to list here, and the author of 11 books, including his most recent title out this year, Tell Me When It's Over, An Insider's Guide to Deciphering COVID Myths and Navigating Our Post-Pandemic World. So I'll invite you up here, Dr. Offit, and just a word about how we'll handle questions and discussion. When the lecture concludes, we can take questions from those of you who are in the audience, and I can also take questions from people who are online. You can either raise your hand or enter your questions in the chat. We are recording this session, and it will be posted to our department's website when ready. Great, thank you.
Thank you. Great. Thank you. Right. So I was asked to be a voting member on the FDA's Vaccine Advisory Committee in 2017. It was great. Nobody cared what we did. Our meetings were utterly unattended. We picked flu strains for the Northern Hemisphere in March and for the Southern Hemisphere in September. We talked about whether we would license the dengue vaccine for Puerto Rico. Nobody cared. Then 2019 hit, and in 2020, we reviewed the Pfizer Moderna vaccines for COVID, and we were being live streamed on YouTube, and we were being asked to be on TV all the time. So our lives changed. And so I'm going to tell you about what my experiences have been over the last 5 years regarding this virus. So I'll start from the beginning. In November, December of 2019, in the southwestern section of the Huanan wholesale seafood market, There was an animal to human spillover event, and SARS-CoV-2 was actually two separate lineages of SARS-CoV-2 entered the human population. It's 3 months later, this virus, which was the original virus, the ancestral strain or Wuhan 1 strain, was isolated and sequenced, and now it was possible to make a vaccine. Now, a typical vaccine timeline it's typically about 15 years from isolation of a virus and then doing preclinical studies in experimental animals, doing small phase 1 studies, trying to understand what is the right dose, the right dosing interval, the right amount of antigen. Then phase 2 studies, which are somewhat larger. Now you think you've got the dose, you think you've got the dosing interval, you think you've got the right amount of antigen. And then phase 3 studies are sort of prospective, placebo-controlled, tens of thousands of people to prove that your vaccine is what you think it is, safe and effective. And then you mass produce the vaccine and then you distribute it. So about 15 years. Our vaccine, I was fortunate enough to work with the team at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. They created the bovine human rotavirus strains that became Rotatech. That was a 26-year effort. And that's not unusual. So that's why this was unusual. I didn't label this, sorry, that's Donald Trump. Okay, you know that. All right. So Operation Warp Speed changed the game. I mean, what the Trump administration did was they put that $11 billion on 6 horses to win 1 race and dramatically shortened the timeline. And this shows you sort of where the money was spent. And by December of 2020, we had 2 vaccines, the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. I really do think that here's a virus that had novel biological and clinical characteristics. The technology to challenge that virus was messenger RNA, which is a technology with which we'd had no previous experience. And within 11 months, you had 2 large clinical trials showing that the vaccine was safe and effective. I think that was the most amazing medical or scientific discovery in my lifetime. And I'm old, so I was actually born before the polio vaccine. And I'm including that as well here. So we were talking about this. Why, if anything, I think I would argue this was probably the greatest achievement in the Trump administration. Why, if anything, does he distance himself from this? And we were talking about this earlier. We think it's because at his heart, he's a deeply modest man who doesn't like to put his name on things. See, they got the joke. All right. So, we'll go back here. Is it back? All right. So, the data that were presented in Pfizer, which was a prospective placebo-controlled 40,000 person trial, showed that it was highly effective against all manner of illness, mild, moderate, or severe disease, 95%. It was remarkable. Similarly, oops, sorry, I'm going the wrong way. That's the Pfizer vaccine. And then same for the Moderna vaccine. Again, this was a 30,000 person placebo-controlled trial in adults. 1-to-1 showing that the vaccine was 94 to 95% effective against all manner of symptomatic illness, including mild illness. And then we did something that was also very hard, which was we mass produced, mass distributed, and mass administered this vaccine in a population that really didn't have an infrastructure for mass vaccinating adults. Was the Biden administration, where in January 2021, after more than 500,000 Americans had died from COVID, the Biden administration immediately began mass producing and mass distributing and mass administering vaccines. On the day that he was inaugurated, healthcare workers were vaccinating 1 million Americans every day. 1 month later, 1.5 million. 1 month after that, another 3 million, 3.5 million. And by July 2021, about 70% of the eligible US population had been vaccinated. Amazing. That was amazing. I mean, what was amazing to me about that was think about 2020. We didn't have anything. We didn't have antivirals till October. We didn't have monoclonal antibodies till November. We didn't have vaccines till December. All we had was avoid human-to-human contact. So we were shuttering schools and closing businesses and restricting travel and isolating and quarantining and masking. And hundreds and thousands of people were dying every day. Yet still, we waited to do these 2 prospective placebo-controlled trials. I know a lot of people who volunteered for these trials because they wanted to have a chance, even if it was just a 50% chance of getting a vaccine. I have a friend actually in North Carolina who was who was in this trial, in the Pfizer trial. And so he gets a shot, doesn't know what it is. And then the next day he wakes up, he has low-grade fever, headache, muscle ache, and he looks at his wife and he says, yes, I got the vaccine. This is why we shouldn't really call those side effects. I mean, these are just natural consequences of your immune response. It's a good thing. But then we hit a wall. About 30% of the United States population simply refused to get a vaccine. They thought the disease wasn't that bad. They thought it at least wasn't going to be that bad for them. They didn't trust the vaccine. They didn't trust us. And that's really what I want to talk about. I want to talk about sort of what happened. I mean, I would have argued that going into this pandemic was undeniable. I mean, everybody knows someone who was sick. Many people know people who were hospitalized or in the intensive care unit or died from this disease. There was no denying the disease. There was also no denying the data for that showed that this vaccine worked. I mean, the way it works, by the way, in our committee is you're given for each vaccine, you're given about 200 pages from the company, their emergency use authorization, and then you're given about 200 pages from the FDA, which is a review of all the data from the company to make sure there's no omissions or misrepresentation. So you get about 400 pages to read, about a week before you're supposed to meet. And then the same thing happened a week later for the Moderna vaccine. So you read about 800 pages, and that's all available. That's all publicly available. You could have read what we read. It's all on the FDA's website. Nonetheless, there was enormous distrust. Here you finally had something to prevent this illness. You finally had a vaccine. I couldn't wait to get a vaccine. I mean, I practically cried when I got my first dose of vaccine because now you had something other than just trying to avoid human-to-human contact to protect yourself against this virus. Nonetheless, there was significant pushback. I would have guessed that this vaccine would have killed the anti-vaccine movement because people were so desperate for it, but clearly there was a percentage of this country that wasn't. So why? I think there are a number of reasons, and I'm just going to go through them here. The first is I think first of all, there's just a general loss of faith in all federal agencies, not just the FDA or NIH or CDC, but also the Department of Justice, the FBI. You can see that they're sort of divided along political lines. There really never was a politics of the anti-vaccine movement. On the left, it was always the sort of all things natural. I don't want to be injected with manufacturing residuals or inactivating agents or adjuvants or stabilizing agents or buffering agents because they all have a chemical name and chemicals are bad. Although I would point out, by the way, water is a chemical. And then on the right, it was this government off my back. Don't tell me what to do. And I think that's what happened here. I think this is sort of an expression of anger against the federal government, the deep state. Okay, the second is, I think the public health measures that we enacted in 2020. So as I said, all we had was limiting human contact. So we did a lot of things that were viewed as government overreach. I think it was the right thing to do. We certainly were overwhelmed in our hospital, and I work in a pediatric hospital, so it was much worse at HUB. But I think it was the right thing to do. But it was seen as the government interfering with our right to act autonomously. I think that the other reason, and I lived through this, I don't know if you remember this, but hydroxychloroquine. So there was a physician named Stella Emanuel who worked with a group called America's Frontline Doctors early in the pandemic. She really was part of this massive disinformation campaign regarding COVID. She explained that nobody needs to get sick. The virus has a cure. It's called hydroxychloroquine. I've treated over 350 patients and not one death. President Trump shared the video of Emanuel's comments to his 84 million Twitter followers, calling it a must watch. I think they are very respected doctors, said Trump. There was one woman who was spectacular, referring to Stella Emanuel. So who is Stella Emanuel? She practiced medicine out of a strip mall in Houston, Texas. She was also the founder of Fire Power Ministries. During her sermon, she preached that alien DNA was used in medical treatments, that scientists were cooking up a vaccine to prevent people from being religious, that cysts, endometriosis, infertility, and miscarriages were caused by women having sex in their dreams with demons and witches, that a witch had concocted a plan to be carried out by the Illuminati to destroy the world using abortion, gay marriage, and children's toys, and that the government is run by reptilians and other aliens who aren't even human. I think the last one actually might not be wrong, but in any case, the other ones made her a questionable source of information for the president. So at a White House press conference, when confronted with Emmanuel's strange beliefs, Trump never backed down. I thought she was very impressive, he said, in the sense that from where she came from, I don't know what country she comes from, but she said she's had tremendous success with hundreds of different patients. I thought her voice was an important voice. So hoping to end the pandemic, the Trump administration purchased 29 million doses of hydroxychloroquine. Then the Trump administration twisted the arm of the FDA commissioner, who at the time was Stephen Hahn, to authorize it for the treatment of COVID, even though there was not a single study that showed that it worked. Now, hydroxychloroquine is an anti-malarial drug with side effects, and the job of the FDA is to stand between pharmaceutical companies and the public to make sure that we don't get products that are unsafe or untested or ineffective. So this was a massive failure, and it scared people, as I'll show you. So this just shows this headline in the Washington Post. The FDA authorizes widespread use of unproven drugs to treat coronavirus, saying possible benefits outweigh the risks. This is not the way the FDA should be. So then studies were done. There was the recovery trial, which was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, where researchers in the United Kingdom randomly assigned 1,600 patients with COVID to receive hydroxychloroquine plus standard care, 3,200 to receive standard care alone. Patients who received hydroxychloroquine were actually more likely to need intensive care, more likely to require more mechanical ventilation, and more likely to die than those in the standard care only group. So not only did it not work, it worsened out. And there was the coalition trial, which was published in the Lancet Regional Health, which were researchers in Brazil, divided 500 patients into three groups. One group received hydroxychloroquine, one hydroxychloroquine plus azithromycin, which potentiated the effects of hydroxychloroquine, and one received standard care only. Patients receiving hydroxychloroquine with or without azithromycin didn't fare better than those who hadn't received either drug. The only difference was that patients who received hydroxychloroquine were more likely to suffer heart and liver abnormalities. Again, hydroxychloroquine didn't work and was dangerous. The Solidarity trial, again reported in the New England Journal of Medicine. This was all within 3 months. Within 3 months of that drug being approved, people went forward very quickly to look to see whether it worked, because it would have been nice to have done that before it was approved, but nonetheless, this is the way it played out. Researchers at more than 400 hospitals in 30 countries randomly assigned 900 patients to receive hydroxychloroquine plus standard care or standard care only. Those who received hydroxychloroquine were again more likely to develop severe heart arrhythmias, which is a consequence of, but rare but real consequence of hydroxychloroquine, and more likely to die than those who received standard care alone. So again, didn't work and it was dangerous. And so 3 months after approving this drug in March of 2020, the FDA basically said that it no longer authorized it. That scared people because what it said to them is that the federal government can twist the arm of the FDA to do what it wants. This fear has not gone away, by the way, since Trump got elected. But this really scared people. And we felt that actually on the FDA Vaccine Advisory Committee. We had nothing to do with the hydroxychloroquine approval. That was done at the commissioner level. So on September 10th, 2020, so the hydroxychloroquine was approved in March. It was taken away in June. On September 10th, 2020, the Kaiser Family Foundation reported that 62% of adults worried that pressure from the White House could cause the FDA to approve a vaccine before it was ready, because the studies were now ongoing, right, in 2020. Amid the confusion, California, Colorado, Connecticut, Michigan, Nevada, New York, Oregon, Washington, West Virginia, and the District of Columbia formed their own vaccine advisory committee. They didn't trust us. They thought we were potentially in the pocket of the executive branch and didn't trust us to make an independent ruling. Todd Omer, who's an epidemiologist at Yale, said, do you really want a situation where some states are making different decisions than other states? I mean, this whole outbreak was confusing enough, but this made it far more confusing. So to try and calm the waters, Stephen Hahn, who was the commissioner of the FDA, published an op-ed in the Washington Post saying that we should trust him. Specifically, I've been asked repeatedly whether there's been any inappropriate pressure on the FDA to make decisions that are not based on good data and good science. I have repeatedly said that the FDA decisions have been and will continue to be based solely on good science and data. The public can count on that commitment, but nonetheless, the public didn't trust him. Now, to his, and this just shows that in the headline form. So now the vaccine's being developed, right? If the vaccine is to be fully tested, which is to say that you have to have a 2-month period of observation after the last dose. That's the way it works. There's vaccines, like all medical products, can have serious side effects, which can cause suffering and hospitalization and death. They're rare, but they're real. But they virtually always, not virtually, they always occur within 2 months of a dose. So the thinking was and remains that you have to wait till 2 months after the last dose in this 2-dose trial until you can safely say that, at least as far as tens of thousands of people are concerned, you don't have a serious side effect. Now that put you into December. Donald Trump wanted that vaccine before the election, which was in the first week of November. So he brought Stephen Hahn into his office, and in an invective-laden tirade, and I have this from a good authority, said, I want this vaccine before November, which meant that you wouldn't have had the 2-month waiting period. But he stood up, Stephen Hahn. He put it on his website, on the FDA website, as a way of saying, this is what we're going to do, and he did it. So good for him. Didn't sort of failed the hydroxychloroquine test, but he definitely passed the vaccine test. Okay, the other thing is explaining what COVID vaccines can and can't do. I think we fumbled this initially, and I'll explain what I mean. So 6 months after the vaccine came out, right? Vaccine comes out in December 2020, 6-7 months later, July 2021. Protection against severe disease was continuing to hold up. This is just a series of several studies showing that you still had very high levels of protection against severe disease. Severe disease is defined as being hospitalized or worse. And the reason is that severe diseases, protection against severe diseases is mediated by immunological memory cells, whether it's memory B cells or memory T cells. It's mediated by, all you need is memory to protect against severe disease. And that you can see that 6 months later, there were still high frequencies of memory B and T cells. The reason that's true is it takes a while to develop severe disease. If you remember, the incubation period is 2 to 4 days. So you will, from the time you're first exposed to the virus to when you will start to develop symptoms, is only a few days. But protection against severe disease is different because it takes 7, 10, 14 days to develop severe disease. That's plenty of time for activation and differentiation of memory cells to become effector cells, memory B cells to become antibody secreting cells, memory T cells to become cytotoxic T cells or killer T cells. So that's all you need. You just need memory for protection against severe disease, because it takes a while to develop severe disease. And that's why you can eliminate long incubation period diseases, because for long incubation period diseases, there's plenty of time for activation and differentiation of memory cells to even protect against mild disease. So you can eliminate those diseases. Smallpox is a long incubation period disease, which we've eliminated. Measles was eliminated from this country in 2020. In 2000, another long incubation period disease. Rubella was eliminated from this country in 2005, another long incubation period disease. Polio is a long incubation period disease, but these short incubation period diseases like SARS-CoV-2, influenza, respiratory syncytial virus, rotavirus, you're never going to eliminate. Rotavirus is a perfect example. 95% of kids get a rotavirus vaccine. We've eliminated the 75,000 hospitalizations that occur every year from rotavirus, severe dehydration, because it takes a while to develop severe disease. But that virus still circulates in the community, still causes mild disease in the community, and that's not going to change. You're never going to eliminate those kind of viruses. Okay, protection against mild disease, we would imagine, is not holding. You can see on the left-hand side that we had protection of like 95% from those clinical trials. Protection had waned to about 50%. Because protection against mild illness is mediated by antibodies present in the circulation at the time of exposure, and antibodies fade over time. This just shows that screwed that up, go back. Yeah, just to make the point that antibody levels do correlate with protection against all symptomatic illness. But antibodies fade. These are universal truths. So because neutralizing antibodies are short-lived, protection against mild illness will always be short-lived. And I just don't think that was made clearly to people. I mean, they thought, hey, I got this vaccine and I still got sick. Worse, they're making me get this vaccine and I still got sick. So if that's true, why did those phase 3 studies look so good? Why did we have 95% protection against mild illness in those phase 3 studies? And the answer is those were 3-month studies. Those people had just gotten their second dose. So that's why those data look so good. Right. Yes, we just talked about that. So this came to the fore in July of 2021 with the Barnstable County outbreak. So on July 4th, 2021, so you're 7 months into the availability of a vaccine, you're still in the 2 doses of vaccine era. Thousands of men got together to celebrate the July 4th holiday in Provincetown, Massachusetts. 79% of those men were vaccinated at that time. Pretty good for 7 months later. Nonetheless, there was an outbreak of COVID. 346 men got COVID, all of whom had been vaccinated. 4 of those 346, or 1.2%, were hospitalized. That's a vaccine working well. That is a moment of celebration. 1.2% hospitalization rate in those who were vaccinated. The other 342 had mild or asymptomatic infection, which the CDC reported in morbidity and mortality report this way. The use of the term breakthrough infections, bad word. Breakthrough implies failure. This wasn't a failure. This was a dramatic success. This was a chance to celebrate this vaccine, and we didn't. We used the term breakthrough, and that term stuck. And for example, Brett Kavanaugh, who was a Supreme Court justice, as part of a routine screening before he could go into the Supreme Court chamber, was tested and found to be SARS-CoV-2 positive and was asymptomatic. If you watch the way this was carried on national television, you would have thought the man was fighting for his life. Really, he was suffering a breakthrough illness. We get the flu messaging is much better. So this is the way we talk about flu vaccine, right? Wild to mild. You're trying to tame the infection. You're just trying to keep people out of the hospital, which is true pretty much of all vaccines. You're just trying to keep them out of the hospital. Trying to prevent mild illness is just unattainable for any length of time. Okay, the next is mandates. Vaccine. I wish we had a better word. I wish we just called them good health requirements. We're a country founded on individual rights and freedoms. We don't like that word. So vaccines were mandated for entrance to schools, bars, restaurants, sporting events, and places of worship, among others, and hospitals. But hospitals were overwhelmed with COVID patients. I mean, I don't know if you remember 2021, but our hospital had 3 floors of COVID patients, and we're a pediatric hospital, and kids are much less likely to be seriously ill than the adults. We had trouble taking care of those patients. Our intensive care unit was overwhelmed with it. We had people working double shifts all the time. We had trouble taking care of other patients. We canceled elective surgeries because we were overwhelmed. We were all talking about the same thing, right? Flattening the curve. And it was galling, frankly, that here you had a vaccine that was licensed for everyone over 18 by December. You had a vaccine that was licensed for everyone over 12 by May of 2021. Yet here we had these older adolescents coming into our hospital, unvaccinated, who were then asking us to take care of them. So they weren't, as far as I'm concerned, they weren't doing their part. Their part was to get vaccinated so that we wouldn't be overwhelmed, so we would have so much trouble taking care of them and everybody else in the hospital who didn't have COVID. And that was really upsetting. I remember actually there was one parent, so the adult, so 17-year-old boy who had severe respiratory disease. So he came into the hospital. Initially, he was on the floors. There was face mask oxygen. Then he went up to the intensive care unit. He was ultimately on a ventilator. He lived, but he was really sick. And I remember asking the mother whether she was vaccinated. She wasn't vaccinated. The siblings weren't vaccinated, but the father, who was there, was vaccinated. So I said, well, why'd you get vaccinated? He just sort of shrugged and said, well, I had to for work. I mean, in a better world, you wouldn't need mandates. In a better world, everybody would have access to the same good information. I would argue I was an informed consumer about this vaccine. I read all 800 pages that had to do with the phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 trials, and I got that vaccine. And I think if everybody else was fully informed and reasonable, they would have gotten the vaccine too. But that's not how people get informed. I mean, when people call me up and say, look, I've done my research and I don't want to get this vaccine, what they really mean by research is they mean looking on the internet to see what people's opinions about the vaccine are. That's what they mean. And I think, it's probably not a good way to say this, but it's to really understand all those data, to really understand all the biological and virological data, and that you really need, to some extent, an expertise in virology or immunology or epidemiology or statistics. You do. And you need to have read those 800 pages, I think, to really understand it. Most people aren't going to do that. Most doctors aren't going to do that. And frankly, most doctors don't, at least universally, have that expertise. So what do? We look to expert advisory committees for that advice. And doctors do that, whether it's infectious diseases or endocrinology or whatever. You look to expert advisory committees, but that is not exactly a message that sells in the 21st century. Trust us, we're experts, because everybody's an expert, right? Because everybody has internet access. Just kidding. Not everybody is an expert. So in any case, this just is a study showing that you were 12 times more likely to be hospitalized if you weren't vaccinated than if you were in 2021. You were 6-fold more likely to be hospitalized in 2022 if you weren't vaccinated. But nonetheless, those mandates really leaned into a libertarian left hook. And I think people saw it as a freedom issue. The word freedom, by the way, has come to bother me. See, there's a problem with just giving me a platform here. The word freedom bothers me. It does, because it just historically doesn't mean something that's always good. All right, because what does freedom mean here? I mean, freedom here means freedom to catch and transmit a potentially fatal infection. I mean, if you cut your foot on a rusty nail and you go to the doctor and you don't want to get a tetanus vaccine and you get tetanus, nobody's going to get tetanus from you. Not a contagious disease. This is a contagious disease. But when you make a choice not to get a vaccine, you're not just making a choice for yourself. You're making a choice for others. I don't know if have you ever read the book Freedom's Dominion? No. Okay. It's worth reading. It's a good read. It just sort of reminds me of when George Wallace ran for president and garnered, by the way, 19% of the vote on a segregationist platform. Everybody remembers him, or none of you remember him because you're all young, but some of the older people may remember him. Tend to be older? No, just me. Okay, so, because he was a segregationist platform, right? Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Everybody remembers that phrase. But if you listen to his speech that he gave when he sort of announced his presidency, he only said that phrase twice. He used the word freedom 20 times. Freedom to what? Freedom to what? To be a segregationist society. That's what he was talking about. In fact, if Nikki Haley, who you remember ran for president on the Republican side here but didn't win, when she was asked the question, what was the Civil War about? She said it was about states' rights. What? It's like, states' rights? Okay, sorry. This is getting too political. All right. Okay, next. I think there's confusion. Oh, by the way, I would say one thing nice, so I can say one thing. Oops, sorry, doing this wrong every time. When Brett Kavanaugh was when his story was put out there, because I was on CNN, we all were, a lot of the vaccine, the people in these advisory committees were on TV a lot, and when I was waiting to be on the little sort of virtual green room before you go on, Lindsey Graham had a quote where he said he'd been vaccinated, but he still got a mild illness. And he said, quote, "This would have been much worse if I hadn't been vaccinated." Right. See, Lindsey Graham got it right. And how often do you get to say that? All right. So now we're in 2021. In August of 2021, President Biden stood up before the public and he said, as of September, so 1 month hence, we, the administration, are going to be offering a third dose of COVID vaccine. That's not the way it works. You don't just declare at the executive level what you're going to be doing with the vaccine. It has to go through the FDA, it has to approve, look at the data on the third dose, and then it goes through the CDC who makes the recommendation. You don't just make that declaration. As a consequence of that, there were 2 senior officials at the FDA that left in protest of that announcement. So we met 3 days before we were supposed to have a third dose and voted no. We all universally voted no because the data didn't support it. It looked like 2 doses, still pre-Omicron. It looked like 2 doses were still good enough to protect you. So we voted no. I'm so sorry, I do this every time. And the CDC met also around the same time and also voted no. So here you have the president of the United States saying we're going to have a third dose in September, and then you had 2 advisory committees saying no. And the reason was you didn't need it. It's still pre-Omicron. 2 doses was still highly effective against severe disease, as was shown by this Mark Tenford study, which was done in December of 2021. So even months after that, showing that in the study of 8,000 immunocompetent adults between March to December 2021, so you're sort of predominantly the Delta era, 2 doses of RNA vaccines versus unvaccinated, you can see that overall the protection for all age groups was still very good against severe disease. There was not good evidence yet for a 3rd dose. And then lastly, so there's plenty of time for questions, there's confusion about the need for yearly doses. Anybody confused about the need for yearly doses? I mean, just out of curiosity, how many of you got a yearly dose this year? Well, about 2/3, maybe half. Got it. Okay. So what's the point of a yearly dose? So we're clearly at different stages of the pandemic. Even by 2022, 95+% of people had either been naturally infected or vaccinated or both. So there's a very high level of population immunity. The goal of the vaccine is to keep you out of the hospital. That's the goal. So the question then becomes, who's getting hospitalized and who's dying from this virus? Who really needs to be protected? And if you look at who's getting hospitalized according to CDC data, it really falls into 4 groups. One is this group, those over 75. So that's it. That is the new definition of elderly, okay? Just so we're clear. Over 75. Because I'm not 75 yet. If I'm 75, then we'll change it again. But for right now, it's over 70. And then the other are people who are in other high-risk groups. So although not on this slide, people who are pregnant, people who are immune compromised, people who have high-risk medical conditions like obesity, diabetes, chronic lung or heart or liver or kidney disease or neurological diseases, people who are immune compromised. So those are the groups that are at greatest risk. So the only 2 countries in this world that recommend a yearly vaccine for everyone over 6 months of age are the United States and Canada. All other countries that have formal recommendations don't make that recommendation. The United Kingdom, Germany, France, Sweden, Norway, Finland, Australia, and the World Health Organization just recommended yearly dosing for those who are in high-risk groups. Regarding vaccinating healthy young people, the World Health Organization stated, quote, although additional booster doses are safe for this group, we do not routinely recommend them given the comparatively low public health returns. So I talked to Dr. Fauci about this, Tony Fauci, who I've known for 30 years, and at a recent meeting, and I said, because I've been sort of on record nationally as saying, I think we should target high-risk groups. And just for which I've gotten an enormous amount of pushback from public health people. The few remaining people that still liked me, I have gotten pushback from. I mean, the anti-vaccine people, I'm okay with them hating me, but then the people who I liked then started hating me. So what was left? So I said, is this wrong? I mean, am I wrong? Am I wrong in targeting this for high-risk groups? He said, no, he agreed. It should be targeted for high-risk groups. But it was his belief, and he may be right, but it was his belief that when you have a targeted message, it's a nuanced message, which is a garbled message. And that if you really want high-risk groups to get vaccinated, recommend it for everybody. Maybe that's true. It's certainly testable, but to my knowledge, it really hasn't been tested. And do you really want to vaccinate a healthy 16-year-old boy who's going to have marginal benefit from that vaccine? What that vaccine will buy a healthy 16-year-old boy is a few months of protection against mild disease. That's what it'll do. And that's it. And so that would be to some extent understandable if this were a seasonal disease. It's not yet. And that's also one of the surprises of this virus. I think everybody assumed it would settle into a winter pattern, as is true for the other 4 strains of human coronavirus that circulate in the United States, but it hasn't. It's still a year-round disease. So therefore, for high-risk group, the CDC recommends that people get 2 doses of vaccine during the year, both before the winter and then 4 to 6 months later, because their data shows that protection against even hospitalization will fade after that in high-risk groups, because high-risk groups do share one thing. They're immunologically not as robust as otherwise healthy people. Okay, so in any case, most people don't get a yearly vaccine. If you look at the left-hand portion of the slide, that's sort of all ages, and you can see that even those greater than 75, still fewer than 50% of people get a vaccine. And then for children, no group really exceeds 20%. Well, so this is my last slide. I think how do we restore the faith in public health? I think one, try not to let politics trump science. I think we do learn as we go. We were building a plane while it was in the air. There was a lot we didn't know about this virus. Probably from a scientist standpoint, the one mistake that upset me the most, which I didn't talk about here, was the bivalent vaccine. The bivalent vaccine was introduced in it was recommended in June of 2022 because Omicron had come into this country. Omicron was a dramatically different virus. So why are we still giving the Wuhan 1 strain? Let's give one of the Omicron strains. And so we thought, okay, let's do this. We'll give a half a dose of, by we, I mean the pharmaceutical companies in concert with the FDA. The FDA Vaccine Advisory Committee, had no input into this. We'll give a half a dose of Wuhan 1 and a half a dose of one of the Omicron variants, which was BA4/BA5. Let's do it that way. That was no better than the monovalent vaccine. Immunological studies showed it wasn't better. Clinical studies done in the US, France, and the UK showed it wasn't better. It wasn't better. And nobody knows this. I don't think that ever got. I wrote a perspective piece in the New England Journal of Medicine, basically making that point. There were certainly 2 articles published in the same issue. I put that in by David Ho's lab at Columbia and Dan Brook's lab at Harvard, showing that it was immunologically no better. And then we had clinical studies showing it was no better. It was no worse. It was just no better. I think the thing that was upsetting was we kept saying it was better. We kept saying you needed to get this vaccine because it was better. And Ashish Jha who was head of the coronavirus task force at the White House, was sort of the point person on that. So I remember there was one moment on CNN when I was on with Pam Brown in the evening, like 6 to 7 segment. And so they showed a clip of Ashish Jha, and he says, need to get this vaccine. It's much better. It's got the Omicron variant in it. Omicron's in the United States. It's different than Wuhan. We need to get this vaccine. And so then they showed me, because I'd published this piece in the New England Journal of Medicine, and she turns to me and she says, well, is he wrong? Yeah, that's not the question you want to answer. You don't want to contradict the White House COVID response coordinator because you work at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and you'd like to continue to work there. So that's not the answer. The answer is, which my answer I gave was, doesn't matter what he says, it doesn't matter what I say. The only thing that matters is what the data show. And here's 2 studies that were just published in the New England Journal of Medicine showing it's no better, it's no worse. People who are in high-risk groups should certainly get it, but it was no better. And I think that's when you start to lose some scientists. I think that was sort of an inside baseball thing, but there were definitely a lot of scientists who were very upset by that positioning of that vaccine as being dramatically better. Did you notice that? Did you notice that bivalent was never any better than what we had?
I suspected it, but
Yeah.
yeah.
All right. So I think we should always explain in detail the science that supports a particular policy. And don't underestimate the public. I think try the best you can to explain the science, realizing not everybody's going to get it, but do that. And then and don't be afraid to engage in public debate about the science supporting a particular policy. I think we're so scared of that. We were so scared of, in any sense, challenging the science behind a public health policy because it was so divisive. There was this side, and you were on the bus or you were off the bus. And I think that for example, when I challenged in public the bivalent vaccine, you were off the bus, and I don't know. It just shouldn't be that way. I think we should just be able to always discuss the science behind a particular policy, but I'm an optimist. I am a Philadelphia Eagles fan. So I'll do everything you need to know. All right, that's all I have. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll take any questions you have.
We are open for business. Yes, go ahead.
RFK Jr. What are we doing?
Okay, I'm going to give you the, I'm actually having a Zoom meeting at 4:30 where there's a bunch of vaccine folks getting together to try and answer that question. So I'm going to give you I'll give you my optimistic view, remembering I am a Philadelphia Eagles fan, and then I'll tell you how I think this played out. So when Donald Trump was elected in 2016, he met with RFK Jr. at the Trump Tower. And after that meeting, RFK Jr. came down onto the first floor and he held a press conference. And he said, I've just talked to Donald Trump. I am going to be the head of something called a division of scientific integrity and vaccine safety. We actually have that division. It's called the CDC. But anyway, that's what he was going to do. That never happened. And Andrew Wakefield, who, published that paper, which was retracted, claiming MMR caused autism, he was invited to one of the inaugural balls. And so between those 2 things, and Trump in 2015, during the run-up to the election, when he had that Republican presidential vote, he said children are getting doses of vaccine that are far too big. They're getting horse doses and they need to get much smaller doses because he would know because he's, a real estate developer. And then he said that a friend of his had a 2.5-year-old child, got vaccines, got sick and had autism. So all the things were in place for that being for Trump's 2016 to 2020 show being a platform for anti-vaccine activists. And it really never happened. I do think RFK Jr. does scare people, even the Republicans. He's pretty out there on all sort of things. I mean, when asked the question, is on Lex Friedman's podcast, is there any vaccine that you think is a benefit? He said no. And then Friedman, who was surprised by that answer, said, well, how about the polio vaccine? He said, I think that vaccine has killed more people than it's saved. I mean, he's really out there for even for the Republicans, sorry, including for the Republicans. What people are trying to do is they're trying to get to Susie Wiles, to the chief of staff, to see whether there can be any influence. I mean, there's all these articles out there and certainly newscasts and podcasts that are against RFK Jr. I think a lot of people certainly who look at the science are trying to do at least that, but that's not getting it done. I think we have to get, because there are groups like the American Academy of Pediatrics, which have congressional influence, or there's a group which was founded by Betty Bumpers and Rosalind Carter called now called Vaccinate Your Family, that also has congressional influence. So I think those groups are now all getting together. We have Sarah Dupre, who is chief of staff for Henry Waxman, that are trying to find a way to influence the government to lessen his impact. I don't think he's going to have an impact on vaccines. I don't, because what can he, not any more than he's already had. I mean, he has a platform by his name alone, so he's always had that. And I think by him hanging around the White House, I think he has a bigger platform than he had, so he can do even more damage. But I think he's not going to eliminate mandates, which are a state thing, not a federal thing. All he's going to do is what he's been doing, which is scare people unnecessarily about vaccines. I don't think he would affect policy, but again, I'm an Eagles
Fingers
fan.
crossed you're correct.
Yeah.
But I've signed up to get all my vaccines because I'm afraid they're all going to go away.
They're not going to go.
All right.
That I don't see how they would really. I mean,
I want to take chances.
Paul, can you say a little bit more about the difference between the FDA advisory committee as truly advisory versus the CDC? So I understand they have to give something a green light before it's allowed to proceed or be recommended. Okay, so so tell us the difference.
Both the FDA's VRBPAC committee, vaccine related biologicals product, and the advisory committee for immunization practices, CDC, are advisory committees. They give advice. There are certainly examples on both sides where they will make a recommendation that's either ignored. So that's happened. But anybody in academic knows that when you give advice, which can either be accepted or rejected. That's true at this committee level too. And that's the other thing. I mean, he talks about eliminating 600 jobs at the NIH, does RFK Jr. So we can eliminate all that institutional memory and expertise and experience, because the NIH has mistakenly focused on infectious diseases instead of chronic diseases, because there's an increase in chronic disease, primarily because we live longer. But in any case, there's an increase in chronic disease. So in that sense, vaccines do contribute to chronic disease because we live 30 years longer than we used to 100 years ago because of vaccines. But that's not going to happen, I don't think. I mean, also, my favorite line of his recently was, we need to just focus on chronic disease, and I quote, and give infectious diseases a rest. Because I'm going to tell you, they're not going to give us a rest.
Oh, sorry, Steve.
Paul, one thing you didn't talk about was the kind of anti-vaccine industry and the kind of profit-making side of that industry. And I imagine in your career, you must have run into folks that are basically trying to make money off of the alternatives, or sort of monetize the anti-vaccine industry. So I wonder if you could just say a word about, like, did that play a role here, and how do you think about their role?
You're right. I mean, we live in just a torrent of misinformation and disinformation. And it's very well funded. It's been much better funded, actually, during the pandemic than ever before. I mean, Children's Health Defense, which is an anti-vaccine group, or Informed Consent Action Network, get tens of millions of dollars in support a year, whereas previously they would get hundreds of thousands. And then there's the profit motive of it, which is alternative medicine people who basically say, like Peter McCullough, who has a COVID survival kit. So he tells you that, that COVID, the vaccine causes you to have vascular abnormalities, but he's got his COVID survival kit, which includes ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine that he sells. So yeah, that's always been true. I mean, the alternative medicine industry sort of thrives in moments like this. Of course, they're the first to call everybody else a shill, but yeah, you're right. The information business, by the way, is a lot less lucrative than the misinformation business.
Can you say more about how pediatricians and general practitioners are informed about vaccines, right? So they could play a really important role in encouraging people to get vaccinated in this quest related to expertise and who has relevant expertise, right? It seems that people trust their own physicians more than they would trust, the government, but that might have been another failure to help make sure that the individual practitioners were spreading the message. What efforts were there to encourage vaccination?
No, I think you're right. I think generally people trust their doctors because that's who they go to when they're sick. I mean, they're not going to go to RFK Jr. when they're sick. So, and for the most part, I think people smell the smoke. They want to know whether there's any fire there, and they are reassured. They are. It's not good for you or your child to go to your pediatrician and proceed to tell your pediatrician you know more than they do. Not that people don't do that. I'm just saying that doesn't work well for your child as a general rule, because you've now fallen into the category of pain in the ass. And my wife is a private pediatrician, so I watch the way she deals with this, which is unequivocally. I mean, basically, she said, these are the vaccines that you do. Let me love your child. Do not put me in a position where you are asking me to send this child out into a world where there's still chickenpox, still pneumococcus, still Haemophilus influenza B, knowing they could come back with one of those diseases because I failed to convince you to vaccinate them. I can't live with that. If you want to continue to see me, this is the way we're going to do it. And with that, she became much more convincing. We don't like that in pediatrics. We don't, because it's confrontational, and we're bad at, we're wimps basically. So we don't like that kind of confrontation. So I think you're right. I think that's who people trust.
It does seem that COVID vaccines were treated differently in that regard, though, right? Like even, if I went to my GP or my kid's pediatrician, they would say, this is the vaccine you're due for. And then they would say, and do you want a COVID vaccine, right? The framing is different.
Well, that also happened with HPV, by the way,
Right.
where they would say that too. And I think you're right. I think it's because of fear of conflict. I mean, I'm watching I now have a ridiculously cute 19-month-old granddaughter. I'm happy to show people pictures after you see, but so her doctor is my daughter-in-law grew up unvaccinated. She grew up in Lancaster County. She's just grew up off the grid. Actually never went to school, although she was homeschooled, eventually got a nursing degree from Harrisburg. So she's doing great, but she never was formally educated, was never vaccinated. So she is now because she's a nurse, but it's been hard to convince her pediatrician to move things along. So I go to those visits, just to be a presence at those visits, at least make him feel uncomfortable. But he's that way. It's this whole kind of, it's like you move from physician to kind of waiter. I'll be your doctor today. A variety of vaccines you might want to consider. It's just. So, but they're not patients anymore, right? They're clients. And I think that kind of terminology tells you where things are. You're right. I think it's because one of the groups most like, I think I have it on the previous slide. Right. Yeah. So if you look at the group, like the 6-month to 4-year-old age group is still, getting hospitalized. So the unvaccinated group is another group. And the vaccination rate in the less than 4-year-olds is like 5%. So that's still getting hospitalized.
We have a question from Anna Wexler online, and she asks, given the rise of public distrust in institutions and science, do we need new and different, perhaps more innovative approaches to addressing the anti-vax movement?
I think, sure, I'm up for anything. I do think we're living in a time where people just declare their own truths, including scientific truths. They do. I mean, I think you have whole parties getting elected based on the deep state. Throw out the deep state. Well, there is no deep state. I mean, this is certainly the public health world. You know everything we know. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. sells his message in part by saying, I'm going to get the real data. I'm going to show you the real data. We're going to get to the bottom of it, right? As if data are being hidden. So people fear conspiracy. I mean, 2/3 of the American public think that this was a lab leak, that this virus was created at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. 2/3 of the American public. Look at the data. It's clear that this was an animal to human spillover event that occurred in stall A in the southwestern section of the Hunan wholesale seafood market, where 2 lineages of the virus are detected. But if you have to believe the conspiracy theory, you have to believe that 2 separate people were infected in the Wuhan Institute of Virology, that then traveled 9 miles across the Yangtze River, went right to a place where an animal to human spillover event would likely occur because a lot of those animals were sold illegally, whether it was palm civets or bamboo rats or raccoon dogs, all in that area, all of whom were found at least by the DNA that was there to have been infected with SARS-CoV-2. When they could have gone to any of 10,000 places in Wuhan, a population of 11 million people, but no, they went there, right? You have to believe that. I mean, it's just, and people do. And Marty Macri, who's a MD, MPH at Hopkins, gets up in front of Congress and says the lab leak is a no-brainer. And so does Robert Redfield, former director of the CDC, and so does the FBI director, Christopher Wray, credible evidence. So I tell you, I think under to quote Pogo, who I think was, as you know, a lovable possum created by the cartoonist Mark Kelly, I've met the enemy and they are us. I think that's true. You see credible people. You look, Joseph Ladapo could well be the next CDC director. I don't know. Do you know this? Is that a familiar name to you, Joseph Ladapo? So Joseph Ladapo is the Florida State Surgeon General, who appointed by Ron DeSantis. He sent out a missive a couple months ago claiming that the mRNA vaccines are quote unquote contaminated with fragments of DNA, which will then enter your DNA, your nucleus, insert themselves into your DNA and cause cancer and autoimmune disease, which is utterly nonsense. I mean, first of all, I'm going to assume Joseph Ladapo lives on this planet and eats anything made from animals or vegetables. Therefore, he has foreign DNA in his circulation, as we all do. And our cytoplasm has mechanisms to recognize and eliminate foreign DNA. There's no nuclear access signal. It can't get into the nucleus. There's no integrase. It can't integrate itself into the DNA. I mean, he's an MD, PhD from Harvard. It's not Penn, but it's a good school, right? I mean, one. It's just, I've seen the enemy in there. That's the hard part. I mean, Peter McCullough was chief of cardiology, at like the Beaumont Hospital in the Midwest. These are credentialed, credible people. It's not the RFK Juniors that scare me. It's the Marjorie Taylor Greens. It's these people.
So we only have a couple of minutes left. I've asked a lot of questions, but I have one more to
Sure,
close
yeah.
this out, which is what do you think is the role of licensing boards for physicians in these kinds of circumstances? Ought they require it as a condition of licensure that you offer vaccines, that you provide scientific information? What's the room for reasonable disagreement here among practicing?
No, that's great. And I think doctors have failed to police themselves. I think that when doctors not only don't vaccinate, but put out bad information. I mean, people like Bob Sears is, MD, fellow of the American Academy of Pediatrics, who writes a book called The Vaccine Book and doesn't, sort of discourages vaccination. They should lose his license to practice medicine. I agree, but we don't do that. We're just because we're wimps. We sort of stand back and just in the name of freedom, let people do what they want. You're right. I think we failed at many levels. And I wish I had an answer to what we can do that's novel, because it's such a global problem. This notion of declaring your own truth. RFK Jr. declares his own truths. I mean, politicians declare their own truths, including scientific truths. I mean, science is becoming like just another voice in the room. And I think it's losing its voice as a source of truth. The lab leak theory is the one that upsets me the most. It couldn't be clearer, okay? But 2/3 of the American, and it's not based on political affiliation. Everybody thinks this was a lab because it's easier, because conspiracies are easy to understand. They're wrong often, not always, but they're wrong generally.
All right.
Sorry, thank you.